during the Subaru Share the Love event. Get attractive offers on various Subaru models, and Subaru will donate $250 to its charity partners, Meals on Wheels, the ASPCA, Make-A-Wish, or the National Park Foundation. There is nothing more powerful than sharing your love, because we're all in this together. The Subaru Share the Love event, now through January 2nd. Find your local Subaru retailer at Subaru.com. Subaru will donate $250 to purchaser or leasee selected national and hometown charities. See retailer or Subaru.com/share for details.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello and welcome to the Race Haven Podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race relations in America. My name is Dr. Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 16 of Race Haven, and today I am joined by my co-host and friend, John Costino. How are you today, John? John, are you there?
Hello, my friend. I sure am. I'm so
Awesome.
happy to be here. It's always a pleasure to join you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Doing well. It's a pleasure to have you here as well, and looking forward to the dialogue today.
Me as well, my friend.
Awesome. Today we're going to break down and dialogue. We're going to break down and dialogue about the Jesse Williams Fiery Humanitarian Award recipient acceptance speech at the BET Awards this past week. It's been a trending topic all throughout social media and the online world, and I'm sure it's also been talked about in the major news networks as well. So John and I are going to take some time to decode his speech from two very different perspectives, one from the African-American perspective and from a European-American perspective. Now, obviously, John and I don't speak for everyone, but we're going to do our best to give you our angle based on our worldview. So before we do that, I first want to tell you why we focus on dialogue on this particular show, because dialogue is greater than debate. And here's why. In debate, there can only be one winner. And in dialogue, participants work together towards collective solutions, win-wins. For example, in dialogue assumes that many people have pieces of answers and that cooperation can lead to greater understanding. That's the purpose behind Race Haven. John and I come together to bridge the race relations divide that still exists in America, primarily between Americans of African and European descent. And John and I attempt to model dialogue through this show to show that through cooperation, it can lead to a greater understanding. Because I personally believe that there's a huge communication gap in terms of the way we perceive the various issues that continue to arise in our country. And to argue and debate with one another would be counterproductive, yet that's what we see going on all throughout, the media, news, and social media. So what John and I do is we dialogue as opposed to debate. So here's what a debate looks like. Debate assumes that a single answer is right and that someone already has it. Okay? And let me say that again. Debate assumes a single right answer that someone already has. And we grew up learning about debate, but very few of us learned about dialogue. So we hope to model what that looks like for you through this show. Now, here is our framework for authentic dialogue on this podcast. Number one, participants listen with a sense of curiosity and ask questions to uncover the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind someone's statements. Number two, participants are willing to communicate their thoughts openly and honestly while putting aside emotions, defensiveness, and a desire to be right. And number three, participants approach someone who sees a problem differently, not as an adversary, but as a colleague in common pursuit of better solutions. So welcome to the dialogue. John, are you ready?
I sure am, my friend.
Awesome. So I like to start out each show with that information, so that everyone can have an idea of how John and I are going to interact. And, we're just going to jump right into it. As I said earlier, the Jesse Williams speech has been trending. This is a special episode that we're going to put out a week ahead of time. We typically post our show every 2 weeks, but we're going to put this one out right away because this is something that is being spoken about, in the media and in the social media sphere where we operate. And we want to get this out and add our voice to the conversation. So with that being said, what we're going to do is I'm going to read various parts of the speech that Jesse Williams gave. And then both John and I are going to give our perspective. And hopefully through those perspectives, we can come to a better understanding and shed some light on the various issues that Mr. Williams brought up in the speech. So just to start out, I want to give John an opportunity to kind of preface anything that he wants to say in light of the speech after I do. So I just want to say from my perspective, when I heard the speech, I thought that it was very powerful. It resonated with me. I do consider myself a social activist. I'm very in tune to the various movements that have various civil rights and human rights movements that have gone on throughout history because I love history, as well as the fights that continue on today. So when I heard the speech, it really, really resonated with me. I thought it was powerful, and I appreciated someone with that platform using his voice to be heard in that way. So, John, do you have any opening statements you'd like to share?
Well, I'll simply say this, and obviously, I appreciate you always being open and wanting to hear this opinion, because I think I speak for a segment of the population that I'll simply say is not polar opposite from where you're coming from, but I in my sincere honesty, I'm not up to date, up to speed, and I don't have intimate knowledge of many of the activist movements, both from the past or current. And, being European American, that many people will just refer to as, hey, this is a white businessman that grew up in the suburbs of South Jersey outside of Philadelphia, I have not been in touch the way you and many others. It's been a very, very instrumental and integral part of your life. So when I hear things, I'm going to bring you a perspective from somebody who is not, racist, bigoted, prejudiced, just kind of going along the way, trying to do my best to bring peace and harmony. And honestly, there's a lot of times where it hits me the wrong way because it feels like a brick coming from left field, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing perspectives and hearing and learning from where you're coming from.
Absolutely. I appreciate that perspective. So let's jump right into it. So I'm going to read various cuts from his speech, and I'm going to start out with right at the beginning, one of the statements that he said. He said that, now, this award, this is not for me. This is for the real organizers all over the country, the activists, the civil rights attorneys, the struggling parents, the families, the teachers, the students that are realizing that a system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do. Now, in my notes here, I highlighted a system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do. So, John, do you want to take the first, swipe at that, and just how does that particular statement hit you?
Well, in all honesty, it's difficult to really differentiate. And again, I'm going to preface by saying I'm not trying to claim to be an expert, in many of the listeners to this radio show and the audience that we have on the blog, far more educated than I'm ever going to be. So I say this, very humbly. But when I hear things that seem to be generalizations, it's hard for me to resonate with it. It's hard for me to appreciate it because I have a different perspective. It's not a right or wrong. It's not a good or bad. It's just a different perspective, a different viewpoint. So it's hard for me, as I'm 48, European American, white guy, businessman, have worked hard my whole life, and quite honestly, nothing was handed to me. I've had to work hard. I've been broke. I've been broke 3 times as an adult just because of, business situations that were out of my control. When I hear things like that, it's, I don't want to say offensive, but it's offending to hear it sound like you've had it easy, I haven't, or we haven't. There's got to be a better way to message that to make a point and not alienate. I guess that's a better word than offend. Alienate people that want to understand. So that is my overall summation. I'm always happy when somebody's on a stage receiving an award, getting recognized, and if they take that time to make a statement, that's wonderful. You've earned that right. But it's important, and I've had to learn this in my career, Scott, to make my point without alienating the audience. And that's where a little bit of that speech hit the wrong way to someone like me who's saying, I'm trying to understand, why are you alienating?
So basically, right out the jump, that initial statement where he said, a system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do. So is it fair to say when you hear something like that initially, it's like is it like he's creating sides, like a us against them type of statement?
Absolutely. I mean, if there's another way to take it, I want to hear that perspective. But the way it sounds to me is right off the bat, and I'm going to be honest with you, flip-flop it and remove it from being him and make it, Al Pacino or Brad Pitt, and it's a we and a we and a we. I can't possibly imagine African Americans hearing that type of a speech and not feeling like, wow, he's trying to divide us. It's just, to me, there's got to be a better way that we encompasses both African American and European American if, and again, only if the goal is solution oriented and let's come together and build a better tomorrow. We have all acknowledged the past, but this speech doesn't, to me, sound like let's all come together.
So I hear you. I'm listening to you, and I hear you loud and clear. And as you stated, Race Haven is different. This isn't just like any other podcast. And, of course, I'm not aware of all the media outlets or podcasts or, other people out there who think like myself in terms of how to get to solutions. But I can just share with our listeners that, I'm passionate about this topic. And I'm passionate about making sure that all voices are heard. Because if we're being real, and I can speak blunt, we have an issue in this country between Americans of European descent and Americans of African descent, where there's a segment of both parties that, a large segment, that have a level of disdain for each other's position. Okay, because we both know that there's Americans of African descent who, pretty much will side with a lot of the things that you said, as well as, if I can be blunt too, and this may take this thing out of context for some of our listeners, but I hear a certain theme when I hear conservative talking heads speak about this issue. And one in particular is Tomi Lahren, and her video has been going around. It's been trending as well. And for those who are listening, if you're interested, just Google Tomi Lahren, Tomi. Tomi Lahren is Lehren. Jesse Williams' response. So Tomi Lahren and Jesse Williams, you just Google that, you'll find her remarks on her show. And she's a fiery conservative talking head or talk show host. And I've heard her position plenty of times around these issues, and I've heard African American people. I share all that to say I've heard African American people who identify as conservative who share those views, and on the flip side, I've heard European American people who identify as allies. And when they identify as allies, there's European American people who say, you know what, I empathize with the things that African American activists are bringing to our attention, and we support them and we stand with them. For example, there's plenty of European American people who are behind Black Lives Matter because they understand the nuance, the complexity. I don't know how, I don't know why. Everyone has their perspectives based on how they were raised, things they've been exposed to, and things that they've taken the time to learn. So with that being said, I say all that as a preface because I don't like to make, overgeneralized absolute statements. So with all that being said, when there is a divide that I speak about in our country, it's not just all African American people on one side or all European American people on another side. So with all justification or preference being stated, I wanted to do this show because I feel like with realizing that racial tension that still exists, the fact of the matter is, how are we going to solve and eradicate that tension if we don't talk to each other? So that's why I hear shows where there's European American conservatives only talking to one another, and other conservatives of other ethnicities sharing their views and ideals together. And then there's shows with people who are African American, where because we're in a minority, a small minority in this country, we tend to band together. Historically, we've tended to band together. So we are a group within ourselves. And then a large percentage of that group, if we're talking politically, will identify as progressive or liberal, and et cetera. So, and if we take the political terms off, they just identify with, these certain civil rights injustices that African American people can readily identify with. So you have those people, and they have their outlets where they talk amongst each other, and there's a few outlets that are out there where people are talking together, and that's what we aim to do here with Race Haven. So I want to say that because I'm listening to John. I'm not dismissing what he has to say. And if this message hit him wrong, I've heard that so many times. So with me wanting to be solutions oriented, I'm always thinking about how important language is. And language is so important. And I think that we have to evolve our language. The next frontier in bringing about equality and equity in this country is going to be so much tougher than the previous frontiers, because the previous frontiers of inequality and inequity were very overt. They were right in our face. You could see slavery. You could see Jim Crow laws. You could see lynchings. You could see these things. You could see, the various, laws that were on the books. You could read them. It was literally written that African Americans could not buy homes in certain areas, or African Americans could not be, cannot receive funding through, various government programs. It was just literally overt racism. Okay. And also the whole concept of white supremacy was overt. The powers that be who formed this country believed that the white race was superior. So those things were very overt in the past. Now the problems that we have are so subconscious and not as out in the open. So we have to figure out a way to attack them at a higher level of consciousness. And I'm always reminded of this quote by Albert Einstein: no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So how can we elevate our consciousness? And how can we elevate our approach? And I think it starts and ends with language. So when someone like John hears Jesse Williams's, speech, and specifically that part that we're talking about now, I can empathize and see how he could feel like, you know what? They're creating these divides. That speech is creating a divide. That speech is creating us against them mentality. Is that the solution? And I personally will say, no, that's not the solution. I'm not saying that here's what I can say. Jesse Williams did the best he could. I know the things that I'm speaking about, we haven't collectively come up with a particular language for that. And I want to be someone who's speaking that into existence. So that's why I'm saying these things, not to condemn what Jesse Williams had to say, but I can also sympathize and empathize, more or less empathize with what John said. So with all that being said, John, I appreciate your patience and allowing me to, articulate this.
No, of course.
A system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do. What that means to me, and if I can decode that, basically that's Jesse Williams speaking to the system that America was built on. And I know a lot of people hate to hear this, and it comes across bad, but it's no way to sugarcoat it. It's like it just is what it is. This country was built on white supremacy, and the founding fathers of this country, and even before this country was founded, the European mindset, the manifest destiny mindset, go out and conquer the world mindset that caused Europeans to set sail and colonize the world and take land. They believed it was their right. They believed that they were the dominant people. Okay, there's something called scientific racism, which I'll get into later, that was later debunked. But these European scientists literally came up with these philosophies that made Europeans the dominant people. So that resonated throughout the culture, and it's something that trickled down throughout the ages, and it allowed for slavery and Jim Crow and all these things to manifest itself. So when we talk about a system built to divide and impoverish, that's what he's talking about. But unfortunately, because of that same system, there's been so many Americans like John who are Americans of European descent, who the system was built for, who've been shielded from the knowledge that people who have been victims of that system, or whose ancestors have been victims, and even today currently are victims of the residual effect of the system and the way it was designed, we know too well intimately. Because it's happened to friends. Friends have been victims, families, ancestors have been victims, or we personally have been victims. And more importantly, because of what we see going around us, we have been motivated to go and do the back research, to have the conversations within our communities to understand these things. But then if there's someone who doesn't have to do that because they are literally a product of that system or a beneficiary of that system, then you're not going to see the trickle down the same way someone who hasn't been, like myself. So when Jesse says a system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do, that's the system he's speaking of. And I have a question for you, John, because, and this is something I've said in other shows, and I'm going to say it now, is that I have a higher level of understanding of systems theory because I actually studied it within my doctoral, research. In my doctoral, I had a class called systems theory. And basically the whole concept of systems theory says that everything that we see manifesting itself in front of us, and there's a lot of players and individuals. However, the design of the system always produces the outcomes. And the design of the system makes the fertile ground or the playing field, and the way things play out, they play out that way as a result of the design of the system. So
Agreed.
all the things that we're seeing, even us right now and how we're playing within a system that was set up years ago. And because the system was designed the way it was, we continue to have so much what's called negative feedback, because not enough people have come together and unified to dismantle and recreate the system. So we continue to react because enough of us haven't come together to be proactive to redesign the rules. So we continue to react based on all the negative feedback that has been designed with, that are a result of the design of the system. So all that leads me to this question, John. How can we have this dialogue on a grand scale? Because I know you'll agree with me, because I know you've done some research now, that our country was built on the concept of white supremacy. So how can we have that conversation when that term in itself turns so many people off? When you talk about white supremacy, and the result of white supremacy is something called white privilege, but those terms by themselves are going to offend so many people. So that's my question to you. Like, how do we broach this conversation with that?
It's a great question. It's a great question, and I'm so glad that we're, like I texted you earlier, I'm excited because we're taking a giant step today. And to answer your question, I'm going to give you a couple thoughts, and then we can dialogue back and forth on it. But number one, it's education. And number two, like we'll call it 1A, it's effective communication. And what I mean by that is 100% agree with you that the system was designed, it was rigged, and it was set up for this to play out. But I'm going to say that it hasn't played all the way out, because part of that whole design includes this frustration / anger / backlash that just tilts the seesaw the other way and creates more of the same. So what I mean by that is, specifically Andrew Barnes, and I'm saying thank you to him, posted a video that you watched, shared with me, I watched, and it was very, very enlightening. That's the only word I can use. It was a level of awareness that you don't get going to school or listening to the media. It's something that you have to choose. So I'm going to further validate your comment that everybody should watch it. I will repost again today, with your permission, that I think everybody should watch it. It should be required. It's 54 minutes long. Yeah.
John, and just really quick for our listeners, some of which who will not be on Facebook, I want to let them know that I will post a link to that video in the show notes at RaceHavenPodcast.com under episode 16. So just know that you will see the link to the video that John is referencing. And Andrew Barnes is a member of the Race Haven Community Dialogue group that we have on Facebook. So I just wanted to give that context. But continue, please.
No, thank you, because it saves me from having to go post it. Now everybody knows exactly where to find it. And again, I'm saying thank you to Andrew because, he was very passionate about making sure people watched it. And you watched it, shared it with me. I watched it. I'm now sharing it with people. It was enlightening. It brought an awareness that you don't get anywhere else. So that's half the battle, the awareness. So now when I watch it and I see some of these things, it allows me to have that same sense of frustration and outrage that you already had and that Andrew already had and that many people that were already aware already had. So you got to allow, if you're trying to land a message on an audience that's unaware, you got to allow them to at least have the chance to be aware. Does that make sense, Scott?
It does make sense. It does make sense.
Now, again, that's just part of it, but the idea is until I'm aware, you're not going to win trying to educate me by being angry. Now, if I had watched it and said, I don't agree with it, or that's propaganda, or then we can have an argument if you want, because at least you gave me the chance to become aware, to get the education. But the second piece of it is, in that awareness, the key is not to alienate. And I think that's where we all, and I'll say we all, because I'm not saying I'm above it, we all have to continue to work daily and minute by minute in our conversations and the way we communicate, even in mass or social media. We have to make sure that we're not alienating, because the whole purpose, hopefully, is to get people who think differently to become more aware and at least move closer to the middle ground. You and I have never said, I'm trying to change your opinion, you're trying to share. We're just trying to share our own views and see if we can't find middle ground if we start off, farther apart. And I'm going to point to one thing that I think really is the problem. It's the lack of communication, the lack of understanding that creates the fear, that creates the anger. And here's my point in that. So Jesse does his BET speech, and you can see everybody that is in support of it is very much in support of it. And it was at the BET Awards, so it was obviously a very heavily African-American audience. Now, here's my rub on this. Justin Timberlake, a white guy who was well-loved and revered by all races, sends out a tweet in support of Jesse Williams, in support, not against, not negative, in support, and he gets ripped upside down in the social media because too many people assume he's not being genuine, that he's not being sincere, that he's profited with his career off of the I mean, how nuts is that, Scott, that here's a guy in the public spotlight, everyone will agree, very successful, very well-loved, very well, respected and revered for his career, supports it, and gets ripped upside down to the point where he's saying, I should have never said anything. That's where I'm throwing back that we have this small group on both sides. It's just filled with, they're so twisted with their frustration, their anger, that they can't even see an ally or someone supportive because they don't look the right way or they didn't say things exactly the way it was supposed to be said. And so what does it do? It further divides us. And that's why I'm saying that starting with Jesse and then Justin Timberlake's, tweet in support, what do? We create more conflict and more division. That's why it's so dangerous for anybody to make any speech on anything unless they're really clear about the audience that they're talking to and the message lands. Because, again, I'm going to toss it back to you right now. The Justin Timberlake tweet just created more problems, and it should have been a supportive response.
You know what? I'm glad you brought that up. So let me read the tweet. So his first tweet was at Jesse Williams, though, hashtag inspired, hashtag BET 2016. Like literally that's all he tweeted. He tweeted basically that he was inspired by the speech. So here's the response. Some of the responses basically were So does this mean you're going to stop appropriating our music and culture and apologize to Janet too? Hashtag BET Awards. So there were a whole list of tweets that were similar to that in response to Justin Timberlake's tweet. Basically, a lot of African-American people who responded in this way, those who responded in this way, not all African-Americans, the ones who responded to Justin Timberlake in these tweets, basically felt like, he appropriates African-American culture and he profits from it and he makes a ton of money. And one day we're going to do a show on appropriation because I'm not an expert on it, and I would like to get an artist on who can, and I have someone in mind, who can help us to really dialogue on the cultural appropriation, because I think that's a great show to have. But basically, on a very surface level, cultural appropriation, a lot of African Americans feel like, or a lot of people, well, not even just African Americans, but feel like African Americans come up with these trends and these sayings and these forms of art, and then European Americans will come along and mimic it, and then they'll go on to make more money than the originators just because they're European American. And so that's kind of, and it's like, without giving the proper credit due to those who created it. And there's, within the African American community, there's a lot of stories on how that's happened throughout history, where African Americans will invent something, and then even, obviously, centuries ago, where during slavery, when African Americans would create something and then their owners would take credit for it and to get all the wealth and all the credit for it, obviously that's how our country started. So again, there's this historical, passed down of this information and this bitterness, and it just continues to get passed down, and we never officially address it. So then again, the system creates this negative feedback. So let me just, now with given that context, I want to say that when I saw it, again, just because of where I am in terms of my level of consciousness, I feel bad for all of us when I just sit back and shake my head and say, this is just a result of the system. Like this, all this negative feedback. And when I say negative feedback, that's a system's term because it speaks in loops, feedback loops. We can have positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. And it's a loop because it continues to come around again. And this is an example of that. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop that continues to rear its head because we never proactively address it. And basically, now on a surface level, again, from a higher thinking level, I feel bad because I'm like, the system continues to bite us and continues to have us at odds. On a surface level, when I see it, I'm disappointed in those people. But at the same time, I say, I don't know what they know. But when I say I'm disappointed, I just mean that you can't, in my opinion, you can't, I feel bad that they would say this to Justin Timberlake because Justin Timberlake, sincerely was just saying he was inspired. Literally, that's it. And for him to get attacked, for saying that, I thought that was sad. And then people went on to say, his second tweet rubbed people, the wrong way even more because he said, "Oh, you sweet soul, the more you realize that we are the same, the more we can have a conversation." So then people, shot back at him with, "Oh, now you're going to hit us with a all lives matter type tweet." So basically people twisted because he never said all lives matter, at least.
No, I was going to say that's the whole point. Here he is trying to say we're more alike than we realize. Let's start thinking together. Let's start acting, in harmony, and he gets ripped again. And I'm not a Justin Timberlake fan. Don't anybody misunderstand this. I'm just saying here's a European-American white entertainer that's not racist in support of Jesse Williams, and he's still getting attacked.
Let me read this one tweet. He said, "I forget this forum sometimes," speaking of Twitter. "I was truly inspired by Jesse Williams' speech because I really do feel that we are all one, a human race." Now, again, people took those words because he said, "I really feel that we are all one." They totally took that and said, he's hitting us with the whole all lives matter. And for those people, a lot of people listening, that the Black Lives Matter movement takes offense to people saying no, but all lives matter, because they feel like it's taking attention away from, the whole idea that we already know all lives matter, which is saying Black Lives Matter because of the disproportionate, murders at the hands of state-sanctioned, police officers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which I have some stats on that for later. But anyway, for this particular cut, what they're saying, people are taking his words and saying that he meant it that way, and he didn't necessarily say that. And I thought that was unfair. And instead of just taking it at the heart of the message is we're all the same. We're just one human race. So I personally found it distasteful. And there's some people that may listen to this podcast that I've chimed in on their Facebook posts, people who I respect, who felt like Justin Timberlake stepped out of bounds as well. And I just didn't see it that way. So that's just my take on it. I don't think he stepped out of bounds. I truly took him at his word that he was inspired and that he truly, believes that, we're all one as a human race. And for people to dig deeper than that, I just felt like people are digging and creating dissension and divisiveness where there didn't need to be any. But at the same time, when I say that, I want everyone listening to this to understand. I say that full well understanding why they feel that way. I say that knowing full well that that's a result of the system. The system continues to produce these things. So
agreed.
Yeah, that's what I have on that, John. 100%. Did you have any more thoughts on that, the first cut, before we get into the second one?
Yeah, I'd love to real fast. And the reason I want to is it's important that what you just said, and I'm agreeing with it, you understand where it's coming from. And so do I. I understand it. I'm not dismissing it. I'm not ignoring it. All I'm simply doing, and this is me just making a plea to people listening and that join the podcast and join the Race Haven blog, if we're just going to remain angry, nothing's going to change. If we're just going to seek to find a flaw in every possible conversation, we can just keep doing this for the next 3 centuries. And then we can all complain about what was wrong and how we personally suffered. But the bottom line is that's not what this is about. That's where, you and I'm not saying we're better than anybody else. We just made a conscious decision to say, you know what, we're not going to sit here and talk like a white guy and a black guy or a conservative or a liberal, but we're going to talk about two guys or talk like two guys about how we can find a solution and improve it. And that's my plea to everybody. And as hopefully these podcasts get out there and more people become our audience, it's just a personal choice. We can always, you and I could find flaw with each other and sit here and make this, a very spirited debate/argument, but we're choosing that even if we don't agree with what we hear, it's coming with the right intention and with a good spirit. So that's all I wanted to say is that that's the choice, to not be angry, to be heard, to be understood, but if we're not understood, to not get angry and say, how can I help him to understand or help her to understand where I'm coming from? So I want to toss it back with that thought process for people listening.
Absolutely, John. And everything you just said again is the core tenets of authentic dialogue, and that's what we're modeling here. So, with that being said, let's get into cut number 2. He says that this is what Jesse Williams said in another part of his speech. Now, he says, what we've been doing is looking at the data, and we know that police somehow manage to de-escalate, disarm, and not kill white people every day. So what's going to happen is we're going to have equal rights and justice in our own country, or we will restructure their function in ours. So the one thing, of course, that I want to highlight in that one is the statement where he says, we've been looking at the data, and we know that police somehow manage to de-escalate and disarm and not kill white people every day. And again, with listening to Ms. Tomi Lahren and her pushback against this speech, she said that he was advocating, violence against police by saying that. So, John, what are your thoughts? How did that hit you when you heard that?
Well, again, and I know everybody thinks I'm some giant conspiracy theorist when I say this. I'm not disputing on any level that there are, without question, people of power that are out of control, and that there are racist police that absolutely, there's case by case. I'm not going to name any cases because I'm not trying to sound like I'm super educated on it, but we've all seen the examples of instances where we need to police the police. We need to clean house across the board. And I get that and support that 100%. But at the same exact time, I'm not going to speak for Jesse Williams, but I'm going to speak for the masses, including you and I, that are controlled by what the media wants us to read. And what I mean by that is anybody that on any level thinks that everything we're told is part of this design and this system that we've been discussing, we are given what we want or what they want us to know, and we have to go hunt down and search for the truth. And I sent you a post that I found that, again, magically never appeared on any of the news outlets. So I'm not saying CNN versus Fox and anything like that. I'm saying that all of the media controls the information and seriously censors it. So when someone says, we've looked at the data, I'm not sure that the data anyone is looking at is accurate, because it absolutely, the statistics are altered and the information is censored. And we can talk about now, or we can wait till later, that post I had sent to you about the 4 African-American kids, the football players. I mean, it's just, and we can post this up on the podcast as well, but the nuts and bolts, without going through the whole story, is, in the media, it's important for them to keep us angry and divided. So when we see the majority, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, Scott, you tell me if this is a fair statement, that the majority of stories that we see in the news about African-American young men, let's say aged 14 to 24, are negative, and they're violent, and they're portrayed as criminals. Is that a fair statement for the most part?
Yes.
So here's an example of 4 young African-American men football players driving down the road and see a female police officer getting punched by a suspect, by someone that she had pulled over. Now, the media would like us to think that those 4 African-Americans would be joining that, would be, beating up the police, would be cheering for that. No, they pull over and they make sure she's okay. They help her out. So why is it that the media does not make that headline news on the freaking papers and in the video that here's a story of 4 African-American, young men that supported a female police officer when they saw her in distress? We don't hear about it. And why? And that's why I say to people, because they don't want anyone to think that's a good story. They don't want anyone to say, oh, wait a minute, you mean it's okay to be a young African-American man and not angry at the police or cheering when that happens? Instead, they're in support of it. And there's probably thousands of stories of like that never get put out there so that we can just stay silent. So, no, every young African-American is not a thug and should not hate the police, just like the stories of, you'll see police officers that are helping out young kids. Again, not going to be shown anywhere because they don't want anyone to feel that side of it. So I'm just throwing out there that we are all very, very programmed and controlled by what the media gives us, which is why I unplugged from it. I only watch it to see what it is that's pissing everyone off, because that's where it comes from. So anyway, back to you, but that's why for me, I can't say we trust the data, because the data is all skewed according to what they want us to feel and read.
Okay, I respect that. And that's why I actually came prepared with some of the data that Jesse was referencing. And I'm going to share that in a moment, but I want to first acknowledge everything you said about the media. I totally agree. And I think most people, it's funny because most people would agree with you, but most people still are going to plug in and listen to the media and watch it and consume it. And
it's hard not to get affected, though, if you do that. It's really hard not to get affected.
Right. It's hard not to get affected. And unfortunately, again, everything in this country has a genesis, and the genesis of how the media began, the media learned how to play people a long time ago. And one of the themes that they played on was race. And one of those themes on race were, again, the media was a tool for white supremacy, amongst other things, but white supremacy was one of them, amongst greed and other things in ways that they try to manipulate. But one of those ways was, seeping in the subconscious of European Americans that Black or African American people are dangerous in several different ways. And that's something that has been passed down, and it's something that sells. It gets ratings. So it makes minorities and African Americans upset, and it makes European Americans, feel, I guess, comfortable or validated in their subconscious bias. But it's unfortunate.
Yeah, it just creates
fear. And that's another way. That's a great thing. It creates
unreasonable fear.
Right. And because of that fear, again, it continues to play into the divisiveness that we see. So I totally 100% agree with everything you just stated about the media. But I did want to bring some data. I did want to bring the data to add context to what Jesse Williams said. Because, again, his speech was very surface level for people who just don't know these things. So where I get my data from in terms of race relations in this country is I always look for sociologists. resources from sociologists, okay? Because sociologists are academics who have PhDs who study social patterns. Literally, they study all of these various themes, race relations being one of them, and how it interacts with society. They study the historical threads and the reoccurring trends. They do research on it. They write papers on it. And these people are non-biased in the sense that we all carry our biases. We all have been impacted. However, these people have literal hardcore numbers that when you and I are out eating dinner or, doing our jobs or running our businesses, their day-to-day business is getting into the data. So I lean heavily on sociologists because I know that that's their lifestyle, that's their business. And if anyone's not going to be biased, it's going to be them because they're just going to be presenting facts based on history and based on data, and based on trends. So with that being said, I'm going to post this resource in the show notes as well. But there's a website called the societypages.org, and it's called the Sociologist Toolbox. And it was created by a college professor, and you can find out his information to vet all this out on the site and where he gets his data from. And I'll put a link in the show notes as well as on Facebook. But he writes this about the disproportionate murder of African Americans in this country that Jesse Williams is speaking to. So he says, the question is, which racial or ethnic group in the United States is the most frequent victim of deadly force from law enforcement officers? On the surface, the answer is clear: whites. You can see in the chart below that in 2015 in the U.S., 578 whites were killed by police. This is nearly double the number of blacks at 301. However, we need to compare these rates to the rates of each group in the general population. Of course, whites are the most frequent victims. They are the largest portion of the population. 62.2% in 2014, according to U.S. Census data estimates. If we lived in a society where one's race had no impact, then we would expect to see the portion of each racial ethnic group killed by police equal to that of the portion in the general population. That is not what is evident from the 2015 data. Whites make up a disproportionately smaller number or smaller portion of those killed by law enforcement compared to their portion of the general population, 11.3% less to be exact. Blacks, on the other hand, make up a disproportionately larger portion of those killed, 26.5%, compared to their numbers in the general population, which is only 13.2%. That's 13.3% more, or more than double, than their percentage in the population. So in layman's term, to make that simple, basically, when you look at the data, African Americans only make up 13.2% of the general population in this country, yet police kill 26% of African Americans who die at the hands of police, compared to only negative. Where's the European data? Negative 11% in comparison to the data, for European Americans. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to post the data, but when you look at the proportion to the population, literally, is more than double. And that's the disproportionate. When people say the numbers are disproportionate, that's what they mean. Does that make sense to you, John, what I just shared? Or do you have any clarifying questions you can ask?
No, it absolutely makes sense, Scott. And again, I'm not on any level in support of police brutality. I'm not in support of, racial profiling. I'm not in support of any of that. And those statistics are disgusting. I mean, it should not, wrong is wrong, and it should have nothing to do with race, gender, religion. Right is right, wrong is wrong. And we've just become so biased and so prejudiced and so distorted in this country, again, because of the system that was created generations ago. And we have to find a way. I think the word is healing. We have to find a way to heal. We have to find a way for even the most angry and frustrated African Americans to feel heard and to be healed without, and this is the big word, without pissing off and alienating all of the neutral people. And I'm going to consider myself neutral because I'm not, as we've discussed, I'm not one of those individuals that has this white guilt. I'm not an apologist. I'm not a liberal. I'm a free thinker like yourself. I'm an independent thinker, and I want justice for everyone, but it can't be, it's been this bad for us for this long, so screw you, we're going to go all the way to this side, and you're just going to have to take it. That's never going to be a solution. That just becomes, like I said, the seesaw on the other side. So, those statistics are disgusting, and we've got to find a way to fix that, but without taking it to the other side is all I'm saying.
I agree. And I want to just add some context because, again, when people say, I don't understand why African Americans are so upset when an African American gets killed by the police. And the thing is, and then some people will say because, black on black crime or black on black murder is so prevalent in the African American community, et cetera, et cetera. But so I want to add some context to that because here's the fact. One, these stories have been told to us, and we know the stories of African Americans being mistreated by law enforcement since the beginning of, our emancipation. And so once African Americans were emancipated and they were no longer property, they immediately went into being targeted by law enforcement. So overseers became officers, and the brutalization continued. KKK members were police officers. So KKK members were allowed to march down to police officers to jails and take out African American criminals and lynch them and get their own form of justice. I mean, all types of horror stories that we know of, that we've heard of our ancestors being abused. So there's already a mistrust. And then when things happen, like the murders that all happened in 2015, and then there are some that have been highlighted, like the Eric Gardners or the Tamir Rices or the Michael Brown or the Sandra Bland or things like that. Even though I want to say that she wasn't murdered and proven to be murdered, that wasn't the case, but a lot of people believe that. But with that being said, there's a lot of other names, Rashida Boyd, many others that a lot of African Americans, we know these names by heart. Whereas the average European American like yourself, you don't even know these names. They wouldn't cross your radar. Whereas the stuff that we're talking about, so that's the rub, right? That's where the miscommunication and the divisiveness and the bitterness within the African American community comes from. Because when we look at this data, we see a video that will go online where a European American criminal was trying to reach for the gun of a European American police officer, but yet didn't get shot. But then someone, even in the case of Michael Brown, if we want to be extreme, where the reports are, there are some reports out there that say that he was punching the police officer, so the police officer shot him in self-defense. Well, that police officer not only shot him in self-defense, but he went on to shoot him, I believe, 8 more times. So it's like, why didn't that police officer de-escalate the situation, use a taser, use a billy club, drive away, speed off with the kid's arm in his window, just speed off, or shoot him in the arm to back him off and then call for backup, like all these different things. Whereas African Americans, we believe that because of the indoctrination and the mindset of our lives not being as meaningful, and when a European officer looks at an African American, they see all the negative stereotypes. It's easier to go for the kill and not think about it and show restraint, like the video of them showing restraint. Now, obviously, we know from the data that European Americans get killed by police officers as well. But again, it's so disproportionate in terms of their European Americans' overall numbers in our population. So we see these things, and they cause bitterness and they cause divisiveness. And it is what it is. And you already spoke to it, John, but I wanted to add some context to that. And I hope that our listeners, can understand that. Those people who, and here's what I want to say to our listeners. Don't come up with excuses or say, well, what about, one of the most insensitive things you can say is, what about all the African-American people killing African-American people? Why do you care? That doesn't matter in this conversation. If you want to have a conversation about that, let's have a conversation about crime and murder in African-American communities from an empathetic standpoint. But let's not compare that to police officers killing African-Americans. It's two separate conversations. And what it does is it paints you as a very insensitive person that's looking for an angle that I don't know what the angle is. I don't know what it is in your psyche that says that you have to combine those two things to justify one or the other. I don't know what it is in your psyche that says that just because one police officer is being victimized, that means all police officers, that we're saying all police officers are bad. Like, I don't know where all that comes from, but I'm speaking out as someone who does speak critically against police who misuse force, while at the same time understanding that the majority of police officers don't. So I don't know what it is about this generalization and these absolute thoughts that people feel like, we have to speak in, but I'm rejecting all of that. And I'm just feeling the blame where the blame needs to be put.
I'm going to give you a short answer and then let you continue. It's that seesaw effect. It's that we saw it happen a couple of weeks ago when we had that post, if you despise Obama and support Trump, you must be a bigot. Remember how everyone was responding without even listening to our podcast? They read the headline and literally people commented and started attacking each other. No education, no awareness. It was pure ignorance, and it was just reactionary. That's the answer to your question right there. It takes someone who might even be – because I'm not putting myself in that category. I think first, second, third before I speak, because I don't like having to say I'm sorry I was wrong. I'd rather think it through in my head. But most people, they don't. They don't care about what they're going to say because they're just reacting, and that's where, like you just said, it's two completely separate issues, but not when someone is, instead of thinking about what they want to say and trying to be conscious of what everyone's going to hear when they do speak, they're just telling people, yeah, well, we did this because you did that and you did this, and it's like it's a seesaw. It's a tug of war, and it has no positive solution or result. But that's the answer, Scott. If everyone stays angry, everyone gets angrier, and then they become irrational with their conversations.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. So I want to jump to another cut, and I think that this one will bring out some things here. So the cut I want to jump to is this one, where Jesse Williams says, "We've been floating this country on credit for centuries, yo, and we're done watching and waiting while this invention called whiteness uses and abuses us, burying black people out of sight and out of mind while extracting our culture, our dollars, our entertainment like oil, black gold, ghettoizing and demeaning our creations, then stealing them, gentrifying our genius, and then trying us on like costumes before discarding our bodies like rinds of strange fruit." So before you speak, John, I just want to tell you there is so much nuance and complexity encoded in what I just read. That's more like a poem, like a spoken word piece is how I took it, because, again, if you don't have a certain perspective, you wouldn't understand a lot of what he just said, and I'm going to decode it. But before I do, I want to know how that hit you, John.
You sure you don't want to go first?
Well, if it didn't, if you want to, if you want to,
I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to pose the very unaware response because it
that adds context. I would like you to just, it's not even unaware, and I appreciate what you're saying when you say you're the unaware response and how you're prefacing that. But the thing is, so many European American people, like what you call neutral, and what I say to people all the time in our forums that get really angry when they expect European Americans to know these things, what I say to them is they're victim of the same system that we're victim to. Non-racist European American people are victim of the same system that we are all victims to, meaning the same system has withheld information and put you in a space where you didn't have to consume this type of information or these realities. So how would you know? So I always push back when African American people take this stance that, European American people are willfully ignorant. And I'm like, in a lot of instances, no, they aren't. They just don't know because they don't know. They don't live in this space. They don't live in that world. There's so many layers to being alive in America. So I just want to say that first. And so go ahead, John, just give your perspective and, then I'll jump in.
Okay, perfect. And again, this is something that you and I have talked about, months ago, just as an unrelated topic, but listening to that part of the speech, and again, I'm not going to generalize. I'm just going to talk from my own perspective. I'm watching a gentleman holding an award at the BET, the Black Entertainment Television Awards. And he's talking about, again, this is how it landed on me. I'm held back. My people are, and I'm thinking to myself, are you kidding me? Now, again, this is not a generalization of the history. This is, 2016. I'm not talking about past generations. So am I making that crystal clear so nobody misunderstands what I'm about to say?
Crystal clear.
Okay. On June of 2016, an African-American television star making a boatload of money, holding an award on a stage on a television channel called the Black Entertainment Television, BET, is talking about being held back and being oppressed and the white machine. And I'm thinking to myself, are you kidding me? There's no way on the planet, there's no way possible anybody could do the white entertainment television network and then hold white-only award. I'm like laughing to myself going, are you hearing yourself? Because that's so absurd it couldn't even be thought of, let alone actually done. And yet you're speaking passionately, so I know you're not a hypocrite. I know you're not an idiot. You're speaking passionately. But how do you – this is my whole point. How do you, Jesse, expect me as a neutral European-American businessman who's not racist, who's not this, who's not anything, how am I supposed to hear that message without saying, are you kidding me? And I'm not alone because there's been a ton of backlash both from African-American and European-Americans saying, dude, you're out of control. That's not – you can't say that right now. And all I'm saying to you, Scott, is as an individual who is neutral, I'm not pro or anti anything on the radical side. It's just hard for me. And in my mind, I'm thinking the reverse of that is not even – it's so preposterous you couldn't think it, yet alone do it. And here we are watching and witnessing that. So, yeah, for me, it's tough. It's one of those things where rethink what you want to say, and then I'll be able to receive your message and possibly become a champion of your message. But that right there just – it lands so horribly wrong for someone like me personally. That's all I can say.
Sure. I get it. And again, this is where these conversations need to be had because there's so much context that's just missing from what he said that someone like myself will understand and someone like yourself just wouldn't. And I get that. And the first thing I want to
address... Did I at
least
communicate that well enough that I'm not coming off as some racist that wants to have the White Entertainment Awards or something crazy? I don't want anybody to misunderstand what I'm saying.
You did, and here's the thing, I because I've heard that sentiment before. It's just you don't understand. And basically that's what you've been saying. You just don't. The bottom line is you just lack the context to understand it, and that's what I want to give. And it pains me when stuff like this happens because I know that it's going to get that backlash, and there's so much beauty in what he's trying to convey. But if you don't understand the context behind the whole situation, it's going to come off and not land right with far too many people. And that's where I see as being a flaw within a lot of current civil rights, and activist movements, because they're only speaking to a lot of times a language in a way that the people that already understand the problem can understand. In my estimation, and the reason why I created Race Haven to be an interracial dialogue about race is because I understand that the fact of the matter is European American people make up 62% of this country and African American people only make up 13%. So I have to be able to make sure that the message lands with European American people, where I can share my truth and hopefully in a way where it can land. And I feel like that's what all activists need to start thinking about. So a lot of people get mad at me for having that sentiment. But the fact of the matter is, again, we only make up 13% of this country. We have to figure out a way to unite the country. We have to figure out a way for everyone. I always say this, we all want the same things. We want freedom, we want equality, and we want equity. Everyone wants that. European Americans who are not radicals and African Americans and all other races as well, but this is a show about those two, want those things. However, we speak at each other, we speak about each other. And when I say we, I'm speaking about, when I say we as an activist, I'm speaking as an activist right now. As an activist, we speak, and a lot of the activists, speak at European American people, but they don't speak with enough European American people. And a lot of European American people who get upset at the activists and their messages, they don't speak to African American people who can help them understand. And that's what I think is a huge problem. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to start with the BET Awards. The BET and the network, because I've heard that sentiment from a lot of people. Why is there a black entertainment network? That is so divisive. That's prejudice. That's bigoted in itself. And that's racist. When some people, and I have a different definition of racist, I'm not going to get into that in this show. But people will say, well, that's racist. And again, we did not arrive in 2016 in a vacuum. We cannot forget about the historical context and how we got here. BET was founded in 1980 when no other media outlets would play African American music and art or TV shows or any type of entertainment. Okay. And so BET created that platform, and it was needed. It was a platform, not just the big megastars like the Michael Jacksons of the world and the Princes of the world who can get an audience with anyone. We needed a platform for some of the smaller, not as notable acts. Okay? And BET still serves that purpose. For anyone who watched the BET Awards, there was so much talent on that stage. And the bottom line is there's not enough room on the other networks and the other, award ceremonies, et cetera, to show the full realm and vast talent that is within the African American community and show it with our voice, because the other shows are run by European American people. And there, as we spoke about in previous shows, like the Oscars and things like that, it's still majority European American people who vote on these things. So their bias and based this, they're going to like European American art and things like that more. They're going to give those things, it's just going to resonate with them more. So instead of people looking at the BET Awards as something that's divisive, you should look at it as something that's just showing you the richness of African American culture. African American people are the ones writing the scripts and writing the stage, placements and the whole producing of the show, so we can show it through our artistic lens. It reminds me of when I was in high school. I went to a very diverse high school, and we would have these performances where the Asian Americans would do things from their culture, and we would take it in. The Southeastern Asian Indians would, the South Asian, it might be Southeastern Asian Indians, but the Indians, pretty much, the Asian Indians, they would do song and dance from their culture, and we would take it in. Okay, and then African Americans would do things, and the European American students would do things. So it was a celebration of culture, a celebration of heritage, and that's how I look at the BET Awards, and that's how I urge all of the European American people to take BET and understand that it's not something that's divisive. It's something that literally gives us an opportunity to show our brilliance and our genius in the way that we can from our voice to the world. So with that being said, that's the first thing, and understanding that it started in 1980, because it really, kind of gets under my skin when I hear people use that as a part of their argument. I'm not talking to just you right now, John. I'm saying because I've seen it and heard it so many times, and it's like you got to add some context to it and understand why it's there. And then from there, moving on to the next thing you said, right? You said Jesse Williams is a rich actor, and I could see how people would say that. But what people may not realize is that Jesse Williams was a teacher, and he was an activist long before he was an actor. And he has organizations that he supports, that he runs, and he does various things that are activist-based. He's an actor and an activist. And he grew up in a low-income community, with mixed parents, an African-American father and a European-American mother. But he grew up in a either in or around a low-income community, went to school around these things. His dad and mom raised him with the awareness of these things, so he's always been this guy. Now, I know the way European-American people who don't know him and know his background, or anyone who doesn't know his background, when they first saw him, they think, this rich guy is getting on the stage saying these things. Where does that come from? I can see how you would think that. Why is this rich guy saying these things out of nowhere? He takes his opportunity in this moment on the spotlight to cause divisiveness. I could see how you would say that if you didn't understand his background and his history. This guy Jesse Williams was in Ferguson when the riots were going on and when the protests, and not even just the riots. And you know what? I want to take that back. I apologize for saying the riots, because the media showed primarily the riots, but they didn't show all the peaceful protests that were going on around Ferguson throughout that whole ordeal. So Jesse Williams was there for the protests that were going on in Ferguson. He's always been on the front line for various issues like this for years. And that's why he won the humanitarian award, because it's a humanitarian award that he won because of his work in civil rights and justice for African-American people. So I wanted to give that context. Now, moving forward, I want to talk about the statements. We've been floating this country on credit for centuries, yo. And that's exactly what he said. And what he means by that, again, is going back to slavery. You see, one of the biggest reasons why America rose to be a superpower is because they were able to profit off of free labor for so many years. Literally, wealth was built and infrastructure in this country was built that would have taken so much longer to build, but it was accelerated because it was done on the backs of Africans, of enslaved Africans. That's credit. That's what credit is. But that credit was never repaid. And many African Americans, including myself, are still bitter about that. Now, it's important that I add context to that, because I've heard many European American people say that you're teaching African American people to have a victim's mentality. I reject that. I am no one's victim. I have a doctorate degree in education. I own a house. I own cars and businesses. But yet I'm still bitter and upset about our history. They're two separate things. I don't have to I hate how people equate being aware and speaking out against things that historically hurt our ancestors and equating that to victimhood and acting like I can't progress in this world if I acknowledge the inequities that our country was built on. I reject that. It's nonsense, and we need to stop it. We need to elevate our understanding and our consciousness and our minds to be able to have mature adult conversations about these things so we can get past them. We'll never be able to do that if people want to continue to put labels on things, call people names, and saying you're being brainwashed by the liberal media. I am not liberal. I am not progressive. I am not conservative. I'm Scott Speed. I am a thinker. I am a researcher. Okay? And I have common sense. So I reject all of that, because I hear that when people start speaking like Scott speaks, people say, oh, you're just spitting the old liberal Democrat party line stuff. And I'm not. Trust me, I think and I listen to everyone on both of those sides that the system has created. I reject both sides. I listen to human beings. I don't care what you are. When you have something to share with me, I'm going to listen, no matter what you identify yourself as politically. I see value and I'm listening. I'm pulling the good stuff from what you're saying. So with all that being said, I want you to understand that that's what he's speaking to when he says we've been floating this country on credit for centuries. And we're done watching and waiting while this invention called whiteness uses us and abuses us. Now, context. When he says this invention called whiteness, for people who don't know, when John says it hits him like a brick, again, I get it. And you know who I blame? Again, I blame the powers that be that created the education system and the history system that never informed people that whiteness was literally a social construct that was created. That was never taught in our history books. Okay, the whole concept of whiteness and the white race and the superiority was created from a white supremacist mindset. And there was a lot of work that went into that. Okay, and I'm going to give you some right now, and I'm going to tell you the resource. If you Google, or if you go to Wikipedia and just put in white people, you'll find what I'm about to read. Okay, so basically, according to historian Irene Silverblatt, race thinking made social categories into racial truths. Okay, the history of the modern racist domination has been bound up with the history of how European peoples defined themselves, and sometimes other people, as members of a superior white race. I go on to summarize this. The European scientists who classified Caucasians as the dominant people, had a hand in this. Western studies of race and ethnicity in the 18th and 19th centuries developed into what would later be termed scientific racism. And then 20th century scientists went on to debunk scientific racism. But it was those things were, and this is Scott talking now, and I'm ending the quote, and I'm going to put the resource in the show notes. But it was that's the invention of whiteness that you hear activists speak of, and people who've done this research, that's what we speak of when we say whiteness, because it was created as this dominant system. So when Jesse Williams says, we're done watching and waiting while this invention called whiteness uses and abuses us, that's what he means. And then when he says burying black people out of sight and out of mind while extracting our culture, again, what does he mean by that? Well, the concept of housing discrimination and redlining created urban ghettos. Urban ghettos were created to literally bury black people, as he said, out of sight and out of mind. So the government literally created urban African-American ghettos. It was done intentionally. It wasn't done by accident. You take people out of slavery where they were not able to get an education. They were not able to learn how to read and write and learn the nuances of navigating a system and filling out applications and learning and having the right to vote and all these different things that give you socially and economically. We were shunned from those things. And then all of a sudden, you have all these people who are freed with no psychological treatment from the trauma they just experienced for the last several hundred years, no financial resources to give them a start to navigate a capitalistic society. And then the government pulls these people together and puts them in projects and gives them housing. And then they become stigmatized and said, the government gave you this, and they don't understand why these people are having a hard time building themselves out of it. But we're not going to get into depth in this show, but John, you watched it, and we're going to do a whole show on this. But the government found a way to give over 270 million acres of land to European Americans through the Homestead Act between 1862 and 1934 for a filing fee. The government also, between the years of 1934 and 1968, managed to give millions of European Americans FHA loans so they can buy houses with as little as 10% down. Because before that, you had to have 50% down to buy or build a home in this country. And so the FHA created this amazing program called 30-year mortgages and 10% down. That didn't exist until then. And guess what they wrote in the bylaws? That is not for African people. So up until 1968, when my parents were 18 years old, FHA loans went to 98% European American people. Millions of European American people were able to pull themselves from working class to middle class, and suburbs were built all around this country while African American people wallowed in the ghettos and the slums. And I get emotional when I say that because it burns me up. But yet people want to stigmatize and say that people are playing the victim. You just don't. And I understand it's a system. I'm not mad at you, listeners. I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad at you, John, because you guys didn't know this stuff. I didn't know it. I'm literally still learning this stuff in 2016. I learn more and more every day. But that's what Jesse Williams meant when he said burying black people out of sight and out of mind while extracting our culture and dollars, like entertainment, like black gold, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because of time, I don't have much time to get into that, but the whole gentrification, I mean, we're going to get into all this stuff, but you know, extracting our culture and our talent and our dollars. I mean, you look at the college sports, man, there's a show we can do on that and how people are making millions of dollars off of African-American athletes predominantly. So it's just so many things. And there's never been any government program specifically built to help African-Americans the way that they were made to help European Americans. And then the same European Americans who are benefiting from the perks that were given to their ancestors years ago will say that African Americans are crazy and out of their minds for asking for some type of government assistance or reparations or anything like that. So that's John, we have about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to stop there before we get into our close, and we can transition to our solutions segment. But I just want to give you an opportunity to, if you have anything to say about what I just said.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll use this as the transition to solutions because, you know, the whole time that you were talking, I'm smiling saying, this is what it sounds like when somebody uses their awareness and their intelligence to share versus condemn. And I'm going to use that word because you just translated what felt like being spoken down to by Jesse Williams as a European-American, white, 48-year-old businessman. I'm listening to his speech, and I'm feeling like somehow I should feel guilty or condemned or punished. You just translated it, and I'm able to say, you know what, I get it. You know what, I agree with you. You know what, there needs to be something done. So for me, again, the solution is not as hard as everybody wants to make it out to be. But you don't speak with an ego. You don't speak with an arrogance. You don't speak with an, I'm trying to tell you what you don't know. You're saying, hey, I get it. Maybe this will help you to understand. And see, when you come with that as your intention, when you come with that as your perspective, it's just so much easier to listen, to understand, and therefore to learn, versus to hear somebody. Again, I don't think that was Jesse's intent. I just don't think he's as prepared or versed as you are to deliver a message. He saw an opportunity to get a message out there, and he took it, and God bless you. That's the American way. But if your goal is to make something better, don't alienate and piss off the people you're trying to get across to. Because I don't think anyone that stood up and cheered needed to hear him say it. They already felt it. They're already in that mindset and awareness. So the people he's talking to, like me, what's your goal? What's your purpose and intent for the conversation? So, Scott, all I can say is you just gave the solution, and hopefully I'm articulating well enough what you just did so that people listening can say, okay, that's how you get across a message to someone who doesn't share your perspective because they don't share your history. You and I have as many differences as we have similarities, but our similarity is what binds us and what brings us together, and that's the goal, to bring a better today and a better tomorrow for everybody. So all I can say is thank you for that, extremely well-delivered message that sheds a lot of light on something that I'll just simply say caused more confusion, which becomes divisiveness, than it did good for me and many people that, like I said, heard it the wrong way. And that includes all the angry people that got pissed off at Justin Timberlake. They didn't hear what you just said. They just heard, yeah, finally somebody's standing up for us and you better get out of our way, and, whatever nonsense was going through their heads, instead of saying, wow, he got through to Justin Timberlake, and missed the whole purpose of the goal, which is to bring people to an awareness and to a supportive position.
Well said, John. I appreciate you adding that context to what I said, and I appreciate you saying those words about my message. I think we have a very powerful platform, and I hope many people will listen to this. I think we're doing, good work here. And, again, I just appreciate what you said. I want to add to my thoughts on the solution, and that is what I call truth and reconciliation. And when I heard that South Africa had a truth and reconciliation period after apartheid ended in the 90s, I know a little bit about it. I've read some articles that people said how we need to do truth and reconciliation here in the U.S. I didn't read too much details about how it happened in South Africa, but it seemed to do a world of good there. And I think that here we are, 150 years removed from slavery, 50 years removed from the 1960s and the abolishment of the Jim Crow laws and all the wonderful laws that were passed in the 60s. And let me just add, housing discrimination was actually legal until 1968. We actually had to get, laws passed to end that, even though the results of that still stand today because the damage has already been done. And we'll do a whole show about that. But truth and reconciliation is what's needed, and it needs to happen on a grand scale. That's my solution. Truth and reconciliation. It's not happening in schools. So we need leaders to step up, people with resources, people that can, buy billboards, buy airtime, buy websites and YouTube channels and et cetera, buy the resources and hire people to put this message out, a whole movement. And I hope that John and I's voice can be, we can spark a movement. Truth and reconciliation needs to happen, and we don't have to wait for the government to do it. We can do it ourselves because there's enough people out there that have access. We have our historians and our sociologists who are not, and you'll find that they're not the people on the news stations. We have all these talking heads, but they're not historians and sociologists in most cases. So we have people that are trying to get ratings and make money, and those are the people who are controlling the narrative. But there are truth tellers out there, and we need to have truth. And then we need to reconcile. Once we have the truth out there and everyone has come to an agreement and understand that none of us had anything to do with it. Like, if we can all kind of forgive our ancestors and realize, and especially European Americans, forgive your ancestors, and African Americans, forgive forgive them as well. The people who formed this country and who created quote unquote whiteness and all these various things, we have to forgive and move forward together. That's the solution. So that's our time for today. A special thank you to my co-host, John Costino. John, could you briefly tell our listeners how they can connect with you and your work?
I sure can. In fact, I'm going to give it to you real fast. It's John Costino at yahoo.com is my personal email. I can be found on Facebook. But I'd rather take the second to just simply say, if you're listening to this podcast, please give us our feedback. You know, our goal is real simple, to deliver a message that will make a difference. And for me personally, I don't expect everyone to like me, love me, agree with me, understand me, but understand the intention and the goal is to bring awareness to both me and to all the listeners so that we can come together. So, Scott, I thank you, as always, for giving me the opportunity to participate, to learn, and to hopefully become a part of the solution, my friend.
Absolutely. And we need feedback, too, because as an African American, we need to hear from people like you, John. We need to hear European Americans who are out there saying, listen, I am not a racist. I am not against you. I am for you. But your message is not hitting me right. We need to hear that. We need to hear that. So thank you, John. And for the listeners out there who share John's sentiments, we need to hear from you as well. And I'm actually going to give an email address for the first time, John, so we can take some of those responses. So be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio so that you never miss the dialogue. If you love this show, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher podcast apps. This will help the show gain more visibility and listeners. As John said, we want to hear from you. Email us your perspectives at solutions@RaceHavenPodcast.com. And we will actually read some of those on a future show. Please visit the Race Haven Podcast Facebook page or the Race Haven Podcast or RaceHavenPodcast.com and leave comments and questions about today's show. You can also join our online community by joining the Race Haven Community Dialogue Facebook group. If today's episode resonated with you, please share the podcast link on social media and through email with your family and friends. Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Peace.
This episode of Race Haven was sponsored by Premium Outsourced Apps. Do you have an idea for the next big web or mobile app, but you don't have coding skills? Are you a business owner that is looking to elevate your brand by creating a mobile app for your customers? Premium Outsourced Apps offers superior apps at superior prices by combining a team of American-based project managers with talented and experienced engineers from overseas. Visit PremiumOutsourcedApps.com today to learn about our 50% less guarantee.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
During the Subaru Share the Love event, get attractive offers on various Subaru models, and Subaru will donate $250 to its charity partners, Meals on Wheels, the ASPCA, Make-A-Wish, or the National Park Foundation. There is nothing more powerful than sharing your love, because we're all in this together. The Subaru Share the Love event, now through January 2nd. Find your local Subaru retailer at Subaru.com. Subaru will donate $250 to purchaser or leasee selected national and hometown charities. See retailer or Subaru.com/share for details.
Be the hero at home when you order Outback Steakhouse with delivery or curbside takeaway, located at Clark Crossing in Athens. Delivery begins after 4 p.m. and curbside takeaway is available for lunch and dinner. Order online at outback.com/delivery and get all your favorites tonight.